Books I write, well, the three books I've written about about Britain, has been Reap the Forgotten Harvest, Torrents of Fire, and Cry Blood for the Children. Now, this book starts in 1600 and ends in 1966. It has two families, one Yoruba, I'm Yoruba from Nigeria, one Yoruba family from Aki, from the village of Aki, one English landed gentry family from Yorkshire. What happened to these two families over 360 odd years? You might think it's really strange, it might be quite interesting why I wrote something to do with the slave trade. But the slave trade is one question in British history that's the most unpalatable part of British history, which has not been dealt with. It hasn't died. This slave trade happened. It is finished in 1833 with the Act of Abolition, and it still hasn't finished. It's still a very sore point between us. Between black and white, the slave trade still is there. Why? Because it hasn't been settled. Now, a lot of our children, younger than me, would like to know what it's about. So I decided to write a novel, not a history book. So what I did was this: I wrote 3 history books, 3 novels, and stitched them into each other. So while you're reading the novel about the families, you'll read about the history of black and white people. So if you read these 3 books, if a Martian landed here and you read these 3 books, you'd have an understanding of what all these black and white people are playing on this amazing landscape. Well, I thought it's much better, because our children are not going to read history books any more than, well, very few children read history books. But we learn all our history from novels. That's why I chose a novel, because that's where we all learn our history from. So I wrote these 3 books. Now, what I'd like to say is this. In the period of time I've lived in this country, which is now 60 odd years, I have watched Britain go from the situation I was at, where we had no race relations laws, no child protection laws, in fact no laws to do with human rights at all. We've now got that. Our children have far more protection than we did. In the time when I was young, all the things that could happen to a young black kid happened. All the things that could happen to young children happened. And so what I wanted to do was to write a story about this country. Because we seem to be always learning about black America, white America, everything that happens in America. We never seem to deal with what we have done ourselves here. So I thought it's time we did it. And I thought also that in doing that, we would be giving to the next generation, in one go, we're not asking them to read hundreds of books like I had to do to write these 3 books. We're asking them to read 3. That's it. They'll pick up everything in one go. Everybody who wants to read anything about the slave trade or colonization, decolonization, or what happened, the efforts of black and Asian and African people, well, Caribbean who are African, Africans who are African, and the Asians, what efforts they did in the First and Second World Wars. And what is important is that our people, when I say our people, I mean black people, have been involved in Britain now for centuries. They've been involved in every aspect of British life for centuries. And yet, it's only now people are beginning to talk about, they still continue to talk about immigration, as if we have just arrived 5 minutes ago. We haven't. We've been here since the Roman times. And we've been here in quantities at different times of history. We were in here in quite large quantities during the slave trade, when some slaves were freed, and there must have been in 1750, 20, 30, 40,000 people who were free, who were living in London alone, living in Spitalfields and various places like that. And at that time we had Oluda Equiano, who was a freed slave, who wrote a book on slavery, which is published in about 1780 something. We had Granville Sharp, who was an evangelist, and Thomas Clarkson, who basically, those three people led the anti-slavery movement. We know about Wilberforce, but Wilberforce, like most politicians, came in at the end. When you have any particular issue in this country today, what happens is this. There's a big campaign throughout the country, huge campaign. It goes on and on and on. Then one day, it comes up to the doors of Parliament. Why? Because we need to turn it into an Act of Parliament, to turn it into law. And that's where Wilberforce came in. But so once the name Wilberforce sprang out to the fore, everybody like Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, and Oluda Equiano was forgotten. We don't even honour them. And yet these three were the ones who were primarily involved in establishing the reason why black people in this country are free today in this country. Now, I also wanted to kill the notion that in the actual slavery, when I arrived here, I learned about slavery, and I thought every white man had a slave. Every white man was a slaver. That's not true. It was a tiny minority of white people were the slave owners. They owned the plantations, they owned the ships, and they owned the slaves. The tiny minority of black people in Africa, in West Africa, were the ones who were in league with the tiny minority of white ones, and they sold the slaves to each other. Most Africans were never involved. Most English people were never involved. And yet we've never learned, we've gone on to actually think that every white person in this country had a slave. They didn't. They were as much enslaved as we were. They were as much slaves as blacks were. The working class in this country were slaves, were serfs. And they were in that kind of situation where when black people escaped from the ships, when black people wanted to actually find somewhere to live, who do they live with? White working class. They've been our friends to this day, the white working class. And this is something I want you to understand, that we have to be very specific now about who. We can't blame anybody in Britain today for the slavery, because nobody's responsible for it who was alive. But there's people who are still living off the fruits of that slavery. There are cities living off the fruits of that slavery. And they are still people who are still earning money from it. And these are in the minority. And I'm not saying to you that we should be having a big campaign. I think what we should be doing is recognizing real fact and stop blaming the wrong people. And certainly don't blame people who are alive today. I mean, I know that some people still behave as if they were, like, for instance, a certain MP from North Somerset. Tall one, skinny. And, he seems to behave as if everybody's a serf. And he lies down in Parliament because he can't sit up. He says Parliament's too short, so he lies down and he treats everybody. Now that class of individuals, they were responsible, their ancestors were responsible for the slave trade. Their ancestors were responsible to taking the profits from the slave trade
called The Profits from Sugar and Building Cities, Building a State. And I had a wonderful cartoon the other day where Africa had been hollowed out. There's this map of Africa, and it was just a map of Africa hollowed out. And all the stuff that had been taken out of it was piled up in Europe and England and America. And I just thought that was really, really funny because it tells us very schematically, very quickly, where the wealth went. Now, we had those people impoverish Africa. And then we've also got Africans today who are the politicians impoverishing Africa. So it's almost like they're saying, well, we've got to move you out because I want my own little bit of meat as well. All these things I'm telling you is why I wanted to write a book. I just thought I could not put all this stuff and tell my children. I actually wrote it for my sons. I want to sit them on my lap and say to them, listen, let me just tell you this story so you have a very, very good understanding of what Britain has become and and how it came to be the way it is today. I couldn't tell them that. I had to first of all do about 20-year apprenticeship of learning to write a novel. Then I did 2 years traveling down the West African coast, along all over the Caribbean and driving around England. That's 2 years. Then I spent 2 years in the British Library researching. Then I spent 10 years writing the first one. Because it was quite important to I knew that if I wrote the wrong thing, historians, British black and white historians would have a go at me, and I didn't want to get that wrong. Because if you're writing things for the next generation, you really need to make sure that you get it right. Because we were given a lot of bad figures. I mean, first history book I read was, it said, is a paragraph that much about the slave trade. And in that paragraph, it said about 10,000 slaves were taken from Africa. And this is in the 50s. We're reading this, and I thought, I was 8 years old, and I thought, no, that doesn't sound right. But anyway, I carried on. By the time I got to 12 years old, I remember turning around to the history teacher and saying, it's got 10,000. I mean, how can you 10,000 over 400 years, that's not very many. I said, so why are you complaining? He said, oh, well, there may have been a few more than that. And it went on and on. And then when more black people arrived here and they started complaining, then the figure started going up and up and up until we finally got into millions. As to how many millions, who knows? But when you think in terms of how many millions it must have taken to actually raise the Caribbean, that must have been an awful lot of people. And then when you think in terms of, what has happened in that time, of where you've got this separation of Africans from Africa in the Caribbean, and those Caribbean people started to think, we're from the Caribbean. No, you're not, you're Africans. And it's just frustrated me enormously. Why? Because I'm saying, why have we got our African people over here and we've got African people over there, and you've got a division between the two? And that division is what we're starting now to tackle. And we have to tackle it because Ghana has done a very good thing in opening up its doors, in saying, this is a year of return. You can return to go and visit, you can return to go and live, and I think all of Africa has to do that. And because if we don't do that, we're going to carry on this separation. I'm not saying all people from the Caribbean must go back to Africa. If they want to, they should. There's plenty of space for them. But what I would like is to hear that the Caribbean people recognize themselves first and foremost as African. That's what they are. And then they can recognize everything else. But so these are the things I wanted to tell my children. I couldn't tell them in one go. So I wanted them to have a good understanding so that they could teach their white friends. they could say this is what it's all about, rather than this closet history which we have now. Because it's now become in the interest of some to maintain the status quo, to maintain that fallacy, to maintain that fantasy that this is how the world has now arrived the way it is, when in fact that's not. It's being calculated, it's being created, and it's being maintained that way because it serves the purpose of a minority of people. And that minority are in danger right now because the class struggle is beginning to wobble. And the class struggle in this country is beginning to create great difficulties in actually governing this country. And for me, it's fascinating because I'm getting much older now, and therefore I'm now beginning to sit back to watch what I always knew would happen. And that was people will begin to see the reality of the situation that has been created yesterday. And it's come through all the way through to today. And it's our children. I'm so proud of our children, black or white. I really, really am. I'm so proud of them because they're not being as divisive as my generation. My generation, we were divided, and we stayed divided, and we spent an awful lot of time having wars among us. When in fact, what we should have done was spend far more time pulling together. We didn't. Now, what I would say to you is this. That I feel privileged. It's hard to go and sit down for years and years and years to write novels, but I feel privileged. It's a privilege that was given to me to go and do it. Because what I had to do was I had to forget my colour, I had to forget my gender. Because I would want you to read my books and not even know. If you didn't know my name, and you didn't know the colour of my face, you shouldn't actually be able to tell what colour the person was who wrote it, or what gender they were either, because it's written for everybody. And therefore, it's important that you recognise that in in the kind of books I write, especially about the story of the slave trade. That's one that had to be written that way, very, very much so. Because I didn't want to write a book just for black people or just for white people. I wanted to write a book for everybody. And therefore, I wanted everybody to feel that at the end of it, this is a book for me. I can feel this, I can reach this. I understand what he has said, and I also understand that I was not involved. My people weren't involved. My family weren't involved. And I've been talking to quite a few of my white friends now who've been researching their history and who've been talking about relationships with their families had several hundred years ago, where they either helped a slave or they had black people living in their house, so on and so forth. And I think this is very, very important because there's far too much division, and which is now at the point of where we're now, I watch my children. Their relationship between their black friends and their white friends, far closer. They're much, much closer. When we left school, the black ones went all one way, the white ones went all another. My children left school, black, white, green, pink, blue, all went that way and that way. And that was fantastic because they all went to the same pub and they all seemed to see a commonality which we couldn't see. We had that division, and it suited certain people. Suited Enoch Powell, for instance, with his Rivers of Blood speech, and that kind of division that was brought up from all that time ago is what is now trying to divide us again. It's not going to work. It isn't going to work. And it's not going to work because there's a lot more common sense in people today on the ground floor than people upstairs think there is. And so my words to you is to say that we need to have far more people who are involved in writing books, who are involved in actually researching yesterday, and who are involved in researching yesterday in this way. That first of all, we look at the historians of yesterday and we dismiss them. We dismiss them because they were writing, Macaulay, Trevelyan, Durrell, all those historians were from the upper class. And they wrote from upper class position. And they were looking through upper class eyes. And therefore, it wasn't until about 1920, 1930, where the first working class history of England, which was, I think, the People's History of England it was called, A.L. Morton, the People's History of England. That was considered to be the first working class history book about England. Now, here it wasn't about what the kings saw. It wasn't about what the queens and all the gentry saw. It was about what happened to the people on the ground floor. And that's what's far more important. Any history in any country, what's happening on the ground floor is far more important than anything. We know very little about it. And I say to you, you look at yesterday's historians, you read yesterday's historians, and you don't not only dismiss them, you say, we'll take bits and pieces from that and see what was actually going on elsewhere. It took years, I've forgotten who it was, in the 30s, who wrote the first woman's history of England. And what's interesting about that is that if you read history books of yesterday, you wouldn't think women existed. They didn't have any opinions. They were just always in pinafores, or they're always in the kitchen. You wouldn't imagine a woman ever painted a picture or did any science. So it's quite extraordinary. And yet when you get to the sciences of the 19th century, there you have women who really shone with their discoveries in science. And women have always shone in their discoveries of everything through the centuries. But the men who wrote the history books forgot them. Women never painted a picture of any value. And yet now we're beginning to research and we find that women were painting pictures centuries ago. All these things I'm saying to you is that I learned along the way in writing those 3 books. I learned just how much other people who'd been left out of history books had contributed to Britain. And that's why I say to you, when you look at the House of Commons today, it's not representative, and it doesn't reflect the views of this country. So you guys, especially the young ones, must go there and change it. You must change every aspect of it so that it reflects far more what Britain stands for, not the kind of nonsense that's been going on in the last little while, because it's not going to help us get anywhere. And that's why I say to you, in writing that trilogy, help me to understand how much damage had been done to the status quo in this country, and how much we didn't learn, how much we didn't get from yesterday's history books. And so we need to rewrite our history books. So what I'm saying to you today is that so much needs to be relearned in this country. So whether we are in Europe or out of Europe, we will still have to do that learning, because we are so backward when it comes to having a good understanding about Britain. I've been so privileged, and I really mean it. It's been a real privilege to be able to sit down for years, literally years, to go and relearn everything about England, about Europe. And it wasn't just England who did do all this nonsense. Europe helped without just as much. It wasn't just England that loves running into wars. Look at Africa. I mean, England's not there now, and yet Africa is still running into war after war after war. So I say to you that what we actually need now is a facility of understanding to help us with to help us push aside the disgrace of yesterday, because there's so much good in this country. There's so many good things and good people in this country who are getting pushed aside, by the very weakest. We're being led by almost the very weakest we can find in the country is leading us. And yet you've got some of the great brains in this country, and they're nowhere to be seen. They've been squashed out of sight. Why? Because the ones who are leading us have got more money than everybody else. Or they've got their families in a better position than everybody else. In this class-divided country. It is the most class-divided and class-ridden country I've ever come across. And I'm saying that because I studied all these centuries of of the British. And one thing that comes across clearly right till this day is that this country has maintained its class status, its class divisions, to this very day. And it's now it's causing problems, because the class is not going to be something that people can get away with anymore. And people who are upstairs are suddenly beginning to realize that things are beginning to rock the boat. And I say to you, you have to rock the boat. I'm not saying about insurrection, not at all. I'm saying about thought. We have to think differently. We have to go in a different direction. And we have to do different things, and very different to what we used to. I came here in 1953 as a 7-year-old boy. I came here, my parents were here for about 5 minutes, left me in a middle-class boarding school. I then ended up in a children's home, Beach Home, Banstead, Surrey, which was the largest children's home in this country. I started from there. I went from there and I went into the Merchant Navy. And the Merchant Navy, I was cadet officer. After 3.5, 4 years at sea, I did my exams, I became a navigation officer. That's where I started, as a navigation officer in the British Merchant Navy. And from then onwards, I went into journalism, so on and so forth. That's how I got up off the ground floor myself. But as a navigation officer, I learned when we went to sea, we took with us the British in the British ships. We took it with us the status quo. We took with us the class divisions. Because remember, as an officer, the way I was treated as an officer was very different to the way I've been treated as a cadet officer, or very different to the way the able seaman and ordinary seaman were treated. So it was quite interesting in terms of suddenly arriving on a ship when I was a third officer, and suddenly these men were going to have to take my orders and my instructions. And I knew it would be hard for them. Because here was a black man giving the orders. It wasn't going to be easy. And I understood that. So what I thought is, in actually doing the things I did, I learned just how much the British class system, because I'd been in every class. I was climbing the class ladder. And it was really quite interesting, because in climbing the class ladder, I also learned just how much it's going to be very hard to leave where you're born into. Because in England, where everybody else in America and around the world, you kind of earn your class by how much money you've got. In England, you're born into your class. Your accent denotes your class. Your school denotes your class. Everything denotes your class, which is now beginning to change, thank God. But in a ship at sea, believe me, class is what it's about. And not only class is what it's about, orders are given, and you're given in a particular way, and the people who are the workers all came from a certain class. So I want you to know that I do feel privileged having written those books. It's hard work to write books, as you probably know, but I still feel very, very privileged having written it because it gave me the time to understand Britain as a country. And and to say to you today, this country is a good country. There's much good in it. There really is. There's a couple of individuals. There's a couple of nasty individuals who spend a lot of time trying to get more than their fair share. But this country is a good country, and it's got a lot to do. And I say that we will be, when we pass on the baton to the next generation, we'll be passing it into safer hands than ours. Thank you.